Okay, so we're diving deep today
Diving deep.
into 1 Corinthians 13, 1-3.
Yeah.
And I know you've heard it 1,000 times,
Oh, yeah.
preached on it yourself probably.
At any time.
But we're looking for something different today.
Absolutely.
We've been going through sermons from pastors
Yeah.
all across the country, and we're not looking for the Sunday school answers here.
Right.
We're looking for those really unique and interesting approaches to this passage.
We were really looking for the nuggets. You know,
Yeah.
those little golden nuggets of insight.
Yeah, nuggets of insight, those sermon illustrations that'll make you go,
Ooh. I never thought of it that way.
exactly. And that's what this deep dive is all about.
Yeah, that's right.
So pastors, Bible study leaders out there, get your notebooks ready because we're about to unearth some really fresh perspectives on 1 Corinthians 13, 1-3.
I think you're going to like these.
I think so too.
Yeah.
One thing that really jumped out at us is how many pastors are finding these creative ways to illustrate the idea that actions without love are meaningless.
Right.
Like we all know that,
Yeah.
but how do you make it hit home?
Yeah. How do you really drive that point home?
Yeah.
Well, one pastor used a story about getting into a fender bender.
Okay.
And it wasn't even, a major accident, just a little bump. But the other driver, instead of getting angry or upset, was incredibly kind
Oh, wow.
and understanding and even helped him change his tire.
Wow. What a good Samaritan.
Right.
Okay, so how does this tie back into 1 Corinthians 13, 1-3?
Well, here's the twist.
Okay.
This Good Samaritan was actually rushing to a court hearing
Oh, no.
for a crime they committed.
Oh, wow.
So on the surface, they were doing a good deed,
Yeah.
but their heart was far from it.
Yeah.
So the pastor used this to illustrate how even good actions can be empty without love.
Wow. That's a really powerful illustration.
It is.
Really gets you thinking.
It does.
And any other pastors use any other interesting analogies like that?
Yeah. Another one compared loveless actions to a beautifully wrapped gift, but with nothing inside. It looks impressive, but ultimately it's disappointing.
Yeah.
Meaningless.
Yeah.
He even brought a prop to the pulpit,
Oh, wow.
a big shiny box,
Oh, that's great.
to drive home the point.
Yeah, I bet that got people's attention.
I think so.
Speaking of attention, grabbing this whole concept of agape love kept popping up
Yes.
in the sermons that we analyzed.
Mhm.
And pastors weren't just defining it.
Right.
They were really getting into the nitty-gritty, like, what does it look like?
Absolutely. Yeah, one pastor described agape love as the operating system
Okay.
of the Christian life.
I like that.
He said, just like a computer can't function without an operating system,
Uh-huh.
our faith can't function without agape love.
Okay, I like that analogy.
Yeah,
It makes it very concrete.
it does.
What other ways were pastors explaining this kind of love?
Another sermon that we looked at compared agape love to an expertly crafted bridge.
Okay, a bridge.
Yeah. And they talked about how it requires careful planning, strong materials, constant maintenance to withstand the weight of traffic and the elements.
Yeah.
And so this pastor used that image to show how agape love isn't just a fleeting emotion.
Right.
It's a deliberate and sustained effort.
It takes work.
It does. It takes work to build those bridges of love.
So it's not just about, feeling warm and fuzzy.
No.
It's about actively choosing to love,
Yes.
even when it's difficult.
Especially when it's difficult.
And this reminds me of that passage in 1 John 4:8, where it says God is all love.
Yes.
Not just that he has love, but that love is his very essence.
His essence. That's a great point.
And that leads to some pretty big questions.
It does.
If God is as love and we're called to be like God,
Right.
then what does that say about our capacity for love?
Right.
And how does that affect our relationships, our actions,
Our
our whole understanding of faith?
entire understanding of faith. Yeah.
Those are big questions.
They are.
And it seems like these pastors weren't shying away from them.
No, they weren't.
They were really challenging their congregations to think deeply
To wrestle with these ideas. Yeah.
about the role of love
Yeah.
in their life.
Absolutely.
But they weren't just relying on scripture and theological concepts, were they?
Oh.
You mentioned earlier that some pastors were drawing on some unexpected sources
Yes.
for their sermon illustrations.
This is where it gets really interesting.
Okay, let's hear it.
One pastor used the example of, believe it or not,
Okay.
O.J. Simpson.
Wow, okay.
They talked about how Simpson had incredible talent,
He did.
achieved immense success,
Yeah.
but ultimately his legacy is tarnished
Right.
by a lack of character
And love.
and love.
Wow, okay, that's a bold move, bringing O.J. Simpson into a sermon on 1 Corinthians 13, 1-3.
It is.
So I'm curious, how did they connect the dots there?
Well, the pastor argued that just like Simpson's talent and success
Yeah.
were ultimately overshadowed by his flaws,
Right.
so too can our spiritual gifts and accomplishments be meaningless
If they're not rooted in love.
if they're not rooted in love. He even quoted that famous line from the trial.
Okay.
If the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit.
Right.
And applied it to our spiritual lives, saying, if our actions don't fit with love,
Oh, wow.
they must be questioned.
Okay. Now that's a sermon illustration that will stick with people.
Yes, it will.
I like that one. Did any other pastors use similarly surprising examples?
Yeah, another one contrasted the leadership styles of Michael Jordan and Steph Curry.
All right. I did not expect to hear that in a sermon.
Nah.
But I'm intrigued. So tell me more. How did they tie that back to 1 Corinthians 13, 1-3?
Well, they asked the congregation to imagine approaching their Christian lives with that same kind of joyful competitiveness.
Okay.
Not competing with each other,
Right.
but striving for excellence in our love for God and others,
Uh-huh.
fueled by joy rather than ego or ambition.
Wow.
He even suggested that maybe that's what Paul meant when he talked about love not boasting
Yeah.
or not being arrogant,
Yeah.
you know.
Wow. That's a powerful reframing of that verse.
I think so.
It really flips the script on what we often think of as Christian ambition.
It does.
Yeah. This is exactly the kind of fresh perspective I was hoping for.
Me too. And we're just getting started.
I can't wait.
There's just so much more to unpack here.
But before we dive into the theological themes that emerge from these sermons,
Okay.
let's take a moment to let these ideas sink in.
Okay.
What stands out to you so far?
It's a lot of things.
Yeah, me too.
But I think the biggest thing is just how creative these pastors are being
Yeah.
in finding ways to make this passage come alive
Yeah.
for their congregations.
Yeah. And you know what? I think it's really cool that they're not shying away from using examples from popular culture
Yes.
to illustrate these deep theological truths.
Absolutely.
I mean, who would have thought that O.J. Simpson and Steph Curry
Right.
would end up in a sermon on 1 Corinthians 13, 1-3?
You never know where you're going to find inspiration.
That's right. You never know.
Yeah.
All right, so let's take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll dive into some of the theological themes
Sounds good.
that emerged from these sermons.
Looking forward to it.
All right, stay with us.
Those were some pretty powerful illustrations, weren't they?
They were.
But the real depth, I think, comes from the theological themes
Okay.
that emerged from these sermons.
Okay.
You know, it's one thing to paint a picture of love in action, but how do these pastors connect it
Yeah,
to the core of our faith?
that's a great point. Anyone can tell a good story.
Right.
But how are they grounding these ideas in Scripture
Yeah.
and theological understanding?
Well, one theme that really resonated was this idea of love as a divine language.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not just about how we communicate with each other,
Yeah.
but how God communicates with us.
So they're suggesting that love is the primary way that God speaks to us.
Exactly.
That's an interesting concept.
One pastor even described it as a dialect we need to learn, almost like studying a foreign language. And just like learning any new language takes time and effort, developing fluency in the language of love requires intentionality
And practice.
and practice.
That's a great analogy.
It is.
It makes me wonder, what happens if we're not fluent in this language?
Yeah.
Are we missing out on something crucial in our relationship with God?
That's a question a lot of pastors wrestled with.
Okay.
One suggested that misinterpretations and misunderstandings happen when we haven't grasped this concept of
see.
love as God's language.
So it's not just about speaking it, but also about learning to listen
Yeah.
and understand.
And understand it correctly.
What were some ways that pastors encouraged their congregations to develop this fluency?
Well, one emphasized the importance of spending time in Scripture,
Okay.
but not just reading it, but meditating on it, allowing those words to really seep into our hearts and minds.
Okay.
Another pastor suggested practicing active listening in our relationships.
So truly hearing and understanding the needs and perspectives of others.
Yes, exactly.
It's about attuning our hearts to the frequency of love,
Yes.
both in our personal lives and in our relationship with God.
That's good. I like that.
And this leads us to another recurring theme,
Okay.
which is this idea of love as a covenant.
Now, when you say covenant, what do you mean in the context of love? I know it's a theological term,
It is a theological term.
but how are these pastors applying it?
Well, it goes beyond a fleeting emotion
Okay.
or even a consistent action.
Okay.
It's about a binding commitment,
Okay.
a promise that we make and strive to keep.
Like the covenants God made with his people.
Exactly.
So it's not just about loving in the moment, but about making this deliberate choice.
Yes.
To love continuously, even when it's challenging.
Absolutely. One pastor pointed out that God's love for us isn't conditional on our behavior
Right.
or performance. He loves us even when we mess up,
Yes.
even when we're far from him.
Yes.
That's the kind of covenantal love
That we're called to embody.
we're called to embody, yes. That raises the stakes quite a bit, doesn't it?
It does.
It's not just about being nice or doing good deeds.
No.
It's about a deep, abiding commitment
Yes.
to love, reflecting God's unwavering love for us.
That's good.
And that has implications for how we approach everything.
Everything.
Our relationships within the church, our outreach to the community,
Yeah.
even how we handle disagreements and conflict.
Absolutely.
Now, speaking of approaching things differently,
Yes.
one thing that stood out to me was love as the true measure of spiritual maturity.
That's good. What were some of the insights from the pastors on that?
Yeah.
Well, many of them challenged the traditional markers
Okay.
of spiritual maturity.
Go ahead.
They argued that it's not about how much scripture you've memorized or
Right.
how many church events you attend,
Uh-huh.
but about the depth and consistency of your love.
So it's less about outward actions
Yes.
and more about inward transformation.
Exactly.
It's about the heart, not just the checklist.
The heart, not the checklist. That's good.
Yeah. I like that one pastor even said that someone could be incredibly gifted,
Yeah.
a powerful speaker, a talented musician.
Right.
But if they lack love,
Yes.
their gifts are ultimately meaningless.
Meaningless.
That's a pretty stark statement,
It is.
but it really drives home the point.
It does.
It's easy to get caught up in doing things for God
Yes.
instead of just being with God
That's right.
and letting that love flow through us.
Absolutely.
And that's where the true challenge lies.
Yes.
It's not about adding more to our to-do list,
No.
but about examining our motivations,
Mm.
our attitudes,
All right. Yeah.
and ensuring that love is the driving force behind everything we do.
Very good.
Now, all this talk about the depth and complexity of love,
Yeah.
it can feel a little overwhelming.
It can.
What were some practical takeaways
Right.
that pastors offered their congregations
Sure.
on how to actually live this out?
Well, one pastor suggested starting small.
Okay.
Instead of trying to change the world overnight,
Right.
focus on one relationship where you can practice agape love more intentionally.
I like that.
Another encouraged their congregation to actively look for opportunities to serve,
Okay.
not out of obligation,
Right.
but out of genuine desire to express God's love.
So taking those big concepts and translating them into tangible actions,
Exactly.
starting with our immediate sphere of influence.
Our immediate sphere of influence. That's good.
Yeah.
And it's also important to be patient with ourselves.
Oh, yeah, of course.
We're all on a journey with this.
Absolutely.
No one is perfect at loving all the time.
No.
The key is to keep striving, keep learning, keep growing
Yeah.
in our understanding and expression of love.
Those are great words of encouragement.
I hope so.
It's a lifelong process.
It is.
But what an incredible journey to be on.
It is.
Before we wrap up this deep dive,
Okay.
I want to ask you, what was your biggest aha moment from all these sermons?
That was a good question.
What really resonated with you personally?
It was the pastor who spoke about the joy that accompanies true agape love.
Okay.
He argued that when we're operating from a place of love, there's this lightness, this freedom, this
Right.
joy that permeates everything we do.
Like it's effortless.
It's not about gritting our teeth and forcing ourselves to love.
Okay.
It's about tapping into that wellspring of joy that flows from God's heart
Yeah.
and letting it overflow into our interactions with others.
That's a beautiful image.
It is.
It's like when we're truly aligned with God's love,
Yes.
it becomes effortless, even joyful to love others.
It does.
It's not a burden, it's a privilege.
It's a privilege. That's good.
And that's what I hope our listeners take away from this deep dive.
Me too.
That loving like Jesus loved isn't about striving for perfection.
Yeah.
It's about surrendering to the joy
Yes.
of being a conduit of God's love in the world.
That's beautiful.
What a powerful message.
It is.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this fascinating exploration of 1 Corinthians 13, 1-3. Any final thoughts for our listeners?
Yes, just one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into 1 Corinthians 13, 1-3.
We have.
From mailbox mishaps to NBA analogies.
That's right.
We've explored some really creative approaches to this classic passage.
I think so.
But before we wrap up,
Okay.
I want to get all home.
Mm-hmm.
What's the one thing you hope our listeners, especially those pastors and Bible study leaders,
Right.
take away from this exploration?
For me, it really circles back to that idea of love as a divine language. It's not just a concept to teach or preach about.
Right.
It's a way of life
Yeah.
we're invited to embody. And what's really remarkable is how these pastors brought that to life, not just through theoretical discussions, but through vivid illustrations and practical applications.
That's so true. We heard about fender benders and empty gift boxes.
He did.
Even O.J. Simpson making a surprising appearance
What?
in a sermon. It's clear these pastors are going beyond the usual platitudes.
Yes.
And really trying to make this message land.
Make it stick.
In a fresh way.
Absolutely.
Yeah, they're pushing their congregations.
They are.
And hopefully us as well.
And us.
To move beyond just a surface-level understanding of 1 Corinthians 13, 1-3.
Yeah.
And grapple with its implications for how we live, how we lead,
Absolutely.
and how we interact with the world around us.
That's right.
I think that's a key takeaway here.
It is.
It's not enough to just know the words of this passage.
Right.
We have to let them transform our hearts and our actions.
Our hearts and our actions. That's good.
And that transformation starts with recognizing that love isn't just a feeling.
No.
It's a choice, a commitment, a way of being in the world.
A way of being in the world, yeah.
And it's a choice we have to make every single day.
Every day, that's so important.
It's so easy to get caught up in the busyness of ministry.
It is.
The pressure to perform.
The pressure to perform.
The temptation to compare ourselves to others.
Yeah, it's so easy to fall into that trap.
But as we've seen from these sermons,
Yes.
true spiritual maturity isn't measured by outward achievements,
No.
but by the depth and consistency of our love.
That's it.
Yeah, that's such an important reminder.
It is.
It's easy to lose sight of that in the midst of all the demands and expectations
It is.
we face as ministry leaders.
Absolutely.
So how do we stay grounded
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it?
in that truth
Right.
that love is the ultimate measure?
Well, I think it starts with cultivating a deep and abiding connection
Okay.
with the source of love himself, God, through
Yeah.
prayer, through scripture, through simply being still
Mm-hmm.
and allowing ourselves to be filled with his presence.
Yes.
When we're rooted in his love,
Yeah,
it becomes easier to extend that love to others,
it does.
even in the midst of challenges.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
It's like we can't pour from an empty cup.
That's
We need to be constantly replenishing ourselves with God's love
yes.
so that we have something to give to others.
I love that analogy.
And when we approach ministry from that place of overflow,
Yeah.
it changes everything.
It does.
It takes the pressure off of performance.
Yes.
And allows us to serve out of a place of joy and freedom.
Joy and freedom.
That's good. That reminds me of that pastor who talked about joyful competitiveness,
Yes.
using the example of Steph Curry
Right.
and his approach to basketball.
Yes.
It's not about striving for success
Yeah.
out of ego or ambition,
Right.
but about pursuing our calling with a spirit of joy and love.
And that joy becomes contagious.
It does.
When we lead with love, when we serve with joy, it
Yeah.
inspires others to do the same.
Yes.
It creates this ripple effect that can transform entire communities.
That's beautiful.
It is.
So here's a final thought for you to ponder as you go back to your ministries,
Okay.
to your congregations, to your communities.
Yeah.
How can you embody this radical, joyful, transformative love that we've been talking about?
Mhm.
How can you be a conduit of God's love
Yeah.
in a world that desperately needs it?
That's the question.
Yeah, let those questions guide you
Yes.
as you continue to dive deep into the heart of 1 Corinthians 13, 1-3.
That's good.
Thanks for joining us. And until next time, keep seeking, keep exploring,
Keep loving.
and keep loving.